just want to welcome everybody to CSES's first lecture of the semester. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dan Slater. I'm a professor of political science and the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, WCED. I'm also affiliated faculty with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at the University of Michigan. We're especially thankful to our co-sponsors of today's event, the UM's International Institute and the Department of Asian Languages and Culture. Our next lecture will be on Tuesday, October 4th with Professor Adrian de Leon of the University of Southern California, who will present his forthcoming work, The Filipino Subjunctive, a Trans-Pacific Counter-History of Filipinization. Please note this lecture will be on a Tuesday and not our regular day of Friday. Also, please join us for our CSES Welcome Back Potluck Reception on Friday, September 16th at 4 p.m. There's a sign-up sheet online. But today, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Soksamphoas Im. Dr. Soksamphoas Im is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Center for Khmer Studies, where she leads a research project on resilience and recovery among workers in the tourism sector during and post-COVID-19 pandemic in collaboration with the University of Sydney Southeast Asia Center. Dr. Im completed her PhD in political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in 2021. Her research focuses on political development and social welfare policy in contemporary Cambodia. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Im.
Thank you so much, Professor Dan Slater, for your kind introduction, and good morning, everyone on the East Coast, and good evening to those who are joining from Southeast Asia. First, I also want to thank the University of Michigan Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Professor Laura Rozek and Professor Mike McGovern and Jonathan Waldes for inviting me to give a talk today about my research on welfare politics in Cambodia. So I'm very excited to share my research with everyone today. But before I begin, I also want to note that this study topic is my ongoing research, so forgive me for any gaps and limitations in my presentation. So Jonathan, if you can please start the slide. Thank you. So okay, maybe let's move to the next slide. So since I'm talking about welfare reform politics in Cambodia today from the National Aging Policy perspective, I like to start with the current situation of the Cambodian elderly today, and then also walk us back to the Cambodia's welfare history from the post-colonial time, starting from 1953 to present, and I will discuss more in depth about how welfare in Cambodia changes after the disputed election in 2013 and the reason for the ruling party, the Cambodian People's Party, to reform welfare programs in Cambodia. And in discussing Cambodia's recent welfare reform, I will also examine one of the two major welfare reform policies, the Cambodian National Ageing Policy implementation progress, its outputs to date, and its political implications. Next slide, please. So the current generation of elderly Cambodians today, age 60 and above, are among the most resilient generation. This generation was born between 1930 and 1960, and some born a little bit before 1930, and they have lived through multiple wars, and they have lived through the French colonial times, multiple wars, and regimes, revolutionary conflicts. They've experienced many traumatic life experiences from the American-Vietnam War bombard in the 1960s to the early 70s, and the Khmer Rouge genocide in 1970, and the conflict in the 1980s, as well as a coup in the 1990s. Because of the war and conflict, these war survivors never had, this generation never had the opportunity to acquire formal education or any formal employment. And so a majority of them who survived the war, they are illiterate and live an impoverished life. Due to poverty and cultural tradition, also elderly Cambodian depends heavily on their adult children to take care of them, and 90% of them co-resident with their children. Also, I want to note that in Cambodian society, grandchildren are expected to care for their old age parents or grandparents as a form of gratitude. And also, as more than 90% of them practice Buddhism, there's cultural tradition of younger generation caring for the elders is accepted by the society as a form of gratitude. And also, because of this social and cultural acceptance, the state providing welfare to the elderly has never really occurred to the Cambodian rulers, the politicians, until very recently. But that does not mean that Cambodia never really had a welfare program. Like this. In fact, Cambodia's past ruler, King Sihanouk, introduced welfare program to Cambodia in during his reign in 1955. And so during his reign from 1955 to 70, there was a form of welfare program, or so-called the social security pension that existed to provide retirement pension to the civil servants. However, the welfare program didn't last very long when his government was overthrown by General Lonal. In 1970, the welfare program was also vanished, and the country was broke out into war from the 1970 until 1990. So during that time, during that period of time, there was no welfare program in Cambodia, of course, due to wars and conflicts. Next slide, please. So as we can see here, between 1970 and 1990s, Cambodia was in the state of war. In the 1970s, as we can see in the picture, King Sihanouk government was overthrown by General Lonal, and established a short-lived government and self-proclaimed himself as president. His regime was completely dependent on American aid, and during the tail of the American-Vietnam War, when the US needed Cambodia to help it combating the North Vietnam's Viet Cong army that flee into Cambodia, the American war plan was bombarding Cambodia mostly in the late 1960s to early 70s. And then as the American-Vietnam War ended in mid-70s, so is the Lonal governments that relied on American aid also ended, and Pol Pot invaded Phnom Penh and came into power and turned Cambodia into year zero, which many of us are already familiar with. For is the Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. So during Pol Pot regime, he isolated Cambodia from the global communities soon after he took power, and he resettled hundreds of Cambodian, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians who live in the urban area into rural area and forced them to work in the farm, like rice field mostly, and abolished the country's currency, religions, and outlawed the country's currencies and religion, and isolated from the rest of the world. As we can see in this picture, my family also were are the survivor of this regime too. So during his regime, urban resident and well-educated Cambodians were top on the list to be executed by his regime, as he believed that these people supported Lonal's regime and the Western ideology. So during that short period of time, 3 years and 8 months, Pol Pot kills around, in total, including those that he killed and also those that died from the starvation, around 2.2 million Cambodian died during the Pol Pot regime. I think I lost the slide. So in 1979, the Vietnamese army invaded Cambodia and removed Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge from power after a series of violent battles on the border between the two countries. Pol Pot had sought to extend his influence into the newly unified Vietnam, but his forces were quickly rebuffed after their invasion, and Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge fighters quickly retreated to remote areas of the country. However, they remained active as an insurgency. Albeit the declining influence, Vietnam retained control of the country with a military presence for much of the 1980s over the objections of the United States. And the Vietnamese occupation authorities in Cambodia established the People's Republic of Cambodia on the third pictures here in the 1980s and installed Thein Sein, the current president of the Cambodian National Assembly now, as the pro-Vietnamese communist politician, as the chairman of the People's Republic of Cambodia at that time, and appointed Hun Sen as the prime minister in 1985. Over the decades since, next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Over the decades since the fall of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia has gradually re-established ties with the world community, although the country still faces problems, including widespread poverty and illiteracy. Cambodia did not return to peace until after 1991. Paris Peace Agreement ceasefire, and when the UN Transitional Authority in Cambodia came to organize general election in 1993. The result of the royal party, Phun Sin Pech, led by the King Sihanouk's son, Prince Norodom Ranariddh, won the majority vote of the 1993 general elections, and the Cambodian People's Party, led by Hun Sen, came second. So he basically lost the election. However, he demanded that the UNTAC to form a coalition government, with him being the co-prime minister to Prince Ranariddh. UNTAC agreed to the CPP's demand to form a coalition government, since they did not have the military capacity or internal backing as much as the CPP did to compel the Khmer Rouge insurgents, who at that time were hiding in the jungle, and to compel them to the Paris Peace Agreement ceasefire. And so a coalition government of the two prime ministers, as we can see, Hun Sen and Prince Ranariddh here, was co-governing Cambodia between 1993-97 until the 1997 coup, when Hun Sen orchestrated a coup d'etat against the Prince Ranariddh, the first prime minister, and exiled him to France, and then he organized the 1998 elections. Next slide. So the CPP having controlled the government without the co-prime minister, the CPP, led by Hun Sen, negotiated with the Khmer Rouge insurgent to disarm itself to return for integration, and then organized the second election, of course, without the UNTAC present. The CPP obtained 64 seats, Phun Sin Pech received 43 seats, and Sam Rainsy received 15 seats. In the National Assembly, Sam Rainsy party protested over election manipulation and irregularities. As we can see here, this is the picture that depicts the 1998 elections without the United Nations present. And the CPP armed guard actually tried to destroy the election poll, and also destroying the other party, the opposition party, sit down protests outside of the parliament over the 1998 election irregularities. And so following the 1998 election, of course, the CPP is now taking full control of the government. Prime Minister Hun Sen increased his popularity and consecutively won the majority of the support in 2003 and 2008 and 2013 elections. While there were so many irregularities in all of those elections, but of course without the UN monitoring and also strong opposition party CPP, and CPP having taken control of all the armed force, they have all the power to manipulate the elections and take control of the government. Next slide. Although the CPP won the 2013 election, the party's popularity actually was declining to a degree they never anticipated, from winning 93 seats in 2008 to only 68 seats in 2013. Conversely, the main opposition party to, which is the Cambodian National Rescue Party, a merger of the Sovereignty Party and the Human Rights Party, won 55 seats, nearly outbeat the CPP for the election. So the opposition party, the CNRP, did not accept the result of the elections and accused CPP of manipulating the election and refused to take the seat in the National Assembly. Next slide. The CNRP and their supporters, while refusing to take the seat, the 55 seat in the National Assembly, they marched through Phnom Penh after the 2013 election to demand re-elections and even demand that the Prime Minister Hun Sen to step down. And next slide. The 2013 general election actually gave an important lesson for the CPP. There were some notable factors that contributed to the decline of CPP's popularity and factors that boosted the CNRP popularity. And with that, the governments, there are factors that contributed to their decline, their popularity decline in 2013 elections. And with that, there are a few things that that was quite notable, were the CPP's government economic reform between 1998. After 1998 election, without equal distribution was insufficient to sustain CPP power. And despite the rapid economic development, Cambodia has a serious infrastructure and social development gaps, and equitable access to healthcare education remain a significant challenge and development priority. Furthermore, Cambodia's sluggish progress in the public financial management, public administration, legal and judicial and decentralization reforms pursued over the past decade hampers the ability of the public sector to address the demand of a vibrant civil society organization sector and the rising expectation of an increasingly educated citizenry. And the CNRP, on the other hand, adopted a clear policy agenda in the 2013 election for its campaign, which met the demands of the civil society and the young educated citizens, most of whom were born after the war and the millennial generations. The CNRP support base also lies in the urban population in rural village whose livelihood have been affected by the land grabbing crisis and the youth. The CNRP campaign policy agenda include improving people's livelihoods, such as increasing civil servant salaries and workers' wages, providing universal pension to the elderly starting at $10 per month, and promoting quality and access to healthcare services and higher education and more. The CPP's campaign in 2013 election, on the other hand, focused only on their two core values. Heng Somrin, the CPP, one of the CPP top leader and the president of the National Assembly, said that during the 2013 election campaign, he said that if the CPP wins, we promise that Hun Sen will continue as the prime minister and he will guarantee peace and political and social stability, as well as more development, just like other modern nations. So we can see a very clear difference between the main opposition party and the the ruling party in that election campaign that is also that is a very notable point as to why CPP's lost its popularity in 2013 elections and why it leads them to focus on reforming Cambodia welfare programs. Next slide, please. So learning from the 2013 unexpected election outcome and the increasing criticism and calls for good governance from both Cambodians and Western donors on the lack of reform in socioeconomic development, it urged the Cambodian government to commit to reform and implement social welfare policy programs that appeal as if they care for the population, but is also having to retain their hegemony in Cambodian politics and also improving the CPP's image as championing good governance. And among the many key areas the CPP government committed to reform looks a lot like the CNRP, the main opposition party policy agenda that I described in the previous slide. And this is a quote on the slide, is a quote from the Prime Minister 6 hours marathon speech in September 2013 after the election, of him committing to deepening the reforms in all fields in order to increase competition. This is where the reform, the large welfare reform is taking place in Cambodia, and this is one of the very important speech that was also quoted in many other documents, government documents. Next slide, please. So, however, before I examine how familiar the CPP's government reform agenda is to the opposition party's policy agenda, it's also important to note that the CPP government has launched a socio-economic development strategy known as the rectangular strategy, or what is known to the public as the policy, back in 2004. And this rectangular strategy also includes implementing a social safety net and population policy, where I circle red here in the third and the fourth policy here, that in the third and the fourth phase action plan here, and the link of the CPP reform to both the CNRP policy agenda and their rectangular strategy actually raise some important questions on whether CPP failed, or was they too late to recognize the importance of implementing the social safety net and population policy that they promised in this strategy to their population, or did the CPP fail to recognize the importance of this policy and it facilitate the opportunity for the opposition party to form a good campaign policy agenda and to win the popular vote in 2013. Frankly, I also don't have the right answer to this question, but I hope to address them in my forthcoming paper, as I'm still doing the research. But I just want to note it here. So next slide. However, there are at least some points to note from from the CPP social welfare reform that between 2008 and 2013, there was some form of social welfare that CPP had introduced called the National Social Security Fund for Civil Servants and Veterans. It was actually introduced since 1997, but because of the coup and because of the lack of resources, the National Security was not fully implemented until 2008. And so even though it was implemented in 2008, the National Social Security Fund only supported a small fraction of the Cambodian population who have been formally employed in the public sector, such as the government officials or veterans. So, and with a large majority of Cambodian population have never been formally employed, especially the elderly. An overwhelming majority of the Cambodian population actually left out of the this welfare program and never have any receive any form of social protection from the government. So so that's why this is also what contributed to the CPP declining popularity toward the 2013 elections, and why they needed to make a huge reform after learning a shocking lesson. So next slide. And as committed in his 6-hour speech in the aftermath of the disputed 2013 election, Prime Minister Hun Sen also introduced a large social welfare reform in 2016, which he committed to expand the country's social safety net program to the vulnerable population. And since then, he often reminded the Cambodian people in any of his public speech, saying that his government will never let any Cambodians die of hunger. With that speech, he instructed his subordinate officials to pay attention to the vulnerable and the poor. Next slide. Non-stop critiques of the opposition party, the CPP managed to circumvent the opposition leader, having Samingsi convicted for several charges, which led to self-exile, and Kem Sokha arrested alleged treasonous activities and attempting to topple supposedly legitimate CPP government just before the 2018 election. And also just before the 2018 election in 2017, after the main opposition party was successfully dissolved, the CPP government officially launched 2 major social welfare policy. One is the National Social Protection Policy Framework, and the other one is the National Aging Policy, almost around the same time, right before the election. Next slide. Just picture of the Prime Minister launching the National Aging Policy here with the Minister of Social Affairs. Next slide. So of course, without the main opposition party participating in the 2018 election, the CPP collected all the 123 seats in the National Assembly. And, despite being condemned by many international communities, especially Western donors, and given the increasing suppression and intimidation against freedom of speech and organizational, associational, and political rights, the CPP government responded to those international criticism that the Cambodian government issue an official statement entitled Cambodia Stability and Development First. The statement quoted a former French Prime Minister saying that, what does the vote mean for someone who is hungry? What does freedom of expression mean for someone who is deprived of education? The Cambodian government at this point well understood the need and the psychology of the Cambodian population, especially those who have had traumatic life experience and those who are poor, especially mostly those who have lived through the Khmer genocide regime, where some died or nearly died from starvation. So, of course, no Khmer people, especially those who have lived through this regime, violent time, would ever want to be reminded that they could face that about this type situation of starvation again. So the Cambodian government responded to the international criticism of their regime legitimacy, actually clearly demonstrated that the social welfare reform with these 2 policies and its strategic choice of the top leadership who intends to maintain particular privilege provision for the powerful elites who are considered important for social stability while pursuing broad and modest social welfare provision for the masses. So this statement is clearly shown that the CPP was understanding that what they need to do in order to win the popularity vote from the Cambodian people, but also maintain their the stability of the regime for the following election. So, and next slide will examine how policy like the aging policy actually became a part of this CPP strategic policy choice to maintain their ruling power in Cambodia. So in examining how the national aging policy reflects the Cambodian government's strategic choice, mainly to ensure social stability and strengthen the legitimacy of the regime, I will discuss 3 implications of the aging policy that I found from my field research in Cambodia in 2019 and 2020. First, I'll talk about the policy's comprehensive action plans and the technical implications. And second, I'll talk about the policy outputs after 5 years of implementation. And lastly, I'll talk about how the aging policy implementing implications reflect the larger political agenda of the Cambodian's ruler commitment to reform in the aftermath of the contested election. Next slide. So in examining this case study, I also want to share a little about the policy background. The national aging policy itself is actually a very thin, broad and comprehensive policy document. The policy actually only have like, it's basically just a blueprint documents, and it aims to improve the well-being of the elderly Cambodians by improving the elderly access to 5 basic needs: the financial security, healthcare service, living arrangement, and also improving the opportunity for the elderly to participate in socioeconomic activities, and also strengthening community support for the elderly. Despite having these aims, the policy document does not contain any concrete action plans at the time it was launched. In fact, the policy is just, like I mentioned, is just a guiding principle document, providing blueprint for action, defining parameters with which ministry and stakeholders involved should develop policy, rules, and process based on their respective roles and particular circumstances. Next slide. And it's for this reason that the 13-year aging policy was divided into 3 phases of action plan. The first action plan is basically for the Ministry of Social Affairs to coordinate and to bring together key stakeholders, including development partners and nonprofit organizations, to draft concrete actions, to plan actions plan, and to incorporate existing programs, sub-programs, projects, and activities implemented by other ministries relevant to, that are relevant to the 5 goals that I stated in previous slide. And the second phase is for the Ministry of Social Affairs to lead the review process and drafted action plan, and incorporating the existing program with other concerned ministries, and also conduct pilot study of the plan activity. For example, a workshop on training programs for elderly caregiver and conducting careful study on the Cambodian elderly society. And the third phase action plan has yet to be planned. So this is an evolving process. And this is as far as I know for now, and it's still, the policy is very ongoing. So so I can only provide detail on what the policy now, and in the next slide as well. So please move to the next slide. So these are what I listed here on the slide are the key implementing actors. However, the Ministry of Social Affairs, Veteran and Youth Rehabilitation is the one who lead the implementation of the aging policy in collaboration with other concerned ministries that have programs relevant to the aims list or action plan listed in the policy. And a number of other development partners, mainly the international organizations such as HABAGE Cambodia, UNDP, UNFPA, Oxfam Cambodia, and Japan International Cooperation Agency to have whose mission in Cambodia is to have promote sustainable socioeconomic development in Cambodia. And this NGO provide technical assistance to the Ministry of Social Affairs to implement the national aging policy. Next slide. However, in studying the progress of the policy, I found some interesting implications from my field study that may have contributed to the policy's slow and minimal impact after 5 years, and why they require more support from the non-governmental development partners like the NGOs, like UNDP or HABAGE Cambodia. Although the Ministry of Social Affairs tasked to lead the aging policy implementation, the Ministry of Economy and Finance is the one that in charge of the budget allocation to implement the policy activities. However, when I was doing my research back in mid-2020, there was no budget allocated for the national aging policy implementation. Basically, even a budget just to conduct review and organize meeting to draft the activities plan. And next slide. And then I tag along to a meeting with HABAGE Cambodia to when they went to meet with the National Social Protection Council to advocate for the universal social pension for the old age, which is one of the aim in the policy on improving income security for old people. The General Secretary of the National Social Protection Council said that the government's told HABAGE Cambodia staff that the government's current budget priority is for the National Social Protection Policy, Social Security and Social Assistance Program, which is the ID pool program. He further stated that the ID pool program already benefited some elderly who live in the poor household, and the universal pension for the elderly may be considered after the completion of the social protection policy. So after, next slide, please, sorry. Although knowing the fact that the national aging policy wasn't being prioritized for budget, yet HABAGE Cambodia was, as the only NGO in Cambodia working on aging rights for over 28 years, still continue to work towards empowering older people and their communities with their own resources. And their area of focus mainly fits with everything listed in the national aging policy agenda, including strengthening healthcare, community-based healthcare service, promoting income generation security, water and sanitization, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and also educating the elderly about their rights to participate in social, economic, political, and cultural activities. And they have been the driving force behind this national aging policy, mainly because they have been working on this, on empowering elderly, old people in Cambodia. Even the national aging policy existed. Next slide, please. And here is the pictures of HABAGE Cambodia staff working with Cambodian elderly to establish self-support group called the Older People Association. So they basically form like a community-based group where the old people providing support to each other, is like, especially those who don't, old people who don't really have family or children to care for. So when they join this community support group, they can receive some financial or even emotional support when they need. It's more like a peer support. Next slide, please. And so because the Have Age Cambodia organization has been doing this work for a long time, Ministry of Social Affairs officials have also incorporated some of the program that Have Age Cambodia do to fit in their policy agenda. And this is also this is a picture of the Ministry of Social Affairs officials tagging along with the Have Age Cambodia staff to train elderly people at a go down how to establish the Older People Association recently, July 2022. Next slide. And Have Age Cambodia, in addition to working directly with the old people, they also continue to work with the Ministry of Social Affairs and other NGO partners such as Oxfam and UNDP to work on drafting the Aging Policy Second Phase Action Plan activities, despite knowing that there was no budget being prioritized yet. Next slide. And this is a picture of the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Cambodian Human Rights Committee officials again tag along with Have Age Cambodia staff to visit an older people association in Battambang province to hand out some small donations during COVID-19 pandemic in 21. Next slide. So due to the impacts of COVID-19 in the past 2 years and the implications with the budget priority, the aging policy did not make much progress with its implementation, except for the Ministry of Social Affairs to co-lead the draft and review action plan with Have Age Cambodia for the second phase of the policy. And here's a picture of the Minister of Social Affairs signing an agreement with the UNDP resident representative in June 21 to enhance institutional capacity and operationalize Cambodian National Ageing Policy. In the agreement, the UNDP will provide 2 years of support in the aging policy, including developing the action plan second phase and the rollout of and pilot. So sorry, I have just 2 or 3 more slides. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of the Ministry of Social Affairs organized a meeting in July to draft and discuss the action plan for the second phase action plan of the aging policy with support from the UNDP. And as of September 2022, several activities from the second phase action plan have been carried forward by the Ministry of Social Affairs, mainly the training the elderly caregivers, collecting empirical data on the elderly socioeconomic status supported by the UNDP, and assessing the possibility of established a nursing home. So obviously there's no real impacts yet. Everything is still at the policy is still at its very early stage. Next one. So reflecting on what we know so far, the aging policy has not made any direct impact on the target population, the aging population. Since its launch 5 years ago, the Ministry of Social Affairs has been relying heavily on the NGO partners such as Have Age Cambodia, UNDP, and Oxfam, for example, to help drive forward the policy implementation, from coordinating action plan, drafting meetings to set up elderly community support groups and collecting empirical data on the elderly, as well as rolling out pilot programs such as elderly caregivers training. So next slide. The implications that I found from my field research raised the question of how has the aging policy reflected the larger political agenda of the Cambodian government's commitment to reform after the 2013 election. As I described earlier, this policy is a product of the CPP government's deep reform commitment. However, why didn't CPP government prioritize this aging policy as much as the National Social Protection Policy Framework, even though it was in the same package reform deal? Ultimately, there are two ways to answer this question. First, in practical term, the welfare program is still a new phenomenon in Cambodia. It does not have the institutional capacity ready to implement the policy effectively yet. That is why it needs support assistance from its development partners, especially those NGOs. But on the other hand, the CPP government was playing its win. We can also say that the CPP government was playing its win-win policy card by allowing these NGOs to involve and have drive forward the policy implementation. These Western-funded NGOs not only have the CPP stay committed to its reform promise to strengthen good governance, but also allowing the CPP to stay committed to its reform promise to strengthen good governance, but also allowing CPP government to claim its legitimacy through performance-based, providing its ability to care for the vulnerable population through its broad welfare reform after turning Cambodia into a single-party authoritarian state in 2018. Next slide. So despite international criticism of his long ruling regime and the election irregularities in 2018, Prime Minister Hun Sen can still easily dismiss those criticisms on the international stage, given his ability to maintain peace and political stability in the kingdom over the past 3 decades. And at the 75th session of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific in Bangkok in 2019, he stressed that peace and stability are the indispensable foundation of the development. And reciprocally inclusive and equitable development is a necessary condition to strengthen and ensure security, peace, and social stability. He further stated that despite Cambodians having enjoyed growth over the past decades, some classes of people and communities have not received the proper rights and power, are vulnerable, and have not received enough attention. With that statement, he said the Cambodian government has recognized these gaps and had introduced the National Social Protection Policy Framework and the National Aging Policy. And his government spokesman, Pai Sipan, also mentioned that to achieve the policy, the government needs to maintain peace and stability, which will lead to economic growth and equitable sharing. Such a clear statement from both the Prime Minister himself and the government spokesman corroborated my argument that national aging policy has so far benefited the CPP government more than it has benefited the aging population. The existence of this policy, despite its small impact on the population, allows CPP government to defend its position as being a good government for its people. So my argument is actually also aligned with the statement from the executive director of the Network for Social Accountability, San Chai, that he said that the implementation of social protection policy is less than optimal. He said that policy are good, but the implementation cannot ensure the effectiveness yet, and that effective implementation of some of the policy all require open participation, monitoring, evaluation from the independent actors such as civil society to put the entire government policy into practice. So with this statement, I'll leave a takeaway question here. Did the CPP government really cares more about the aging population, or did they care more about peace and stability of their regime? Next slide, conclusion. So to conclude, the case study of the National Aging Policy provides an important insight because it highlights the method which the authoritarian regime like CPP was able to co-opt the opposition platforms, implement them, and thereby demonstrate reform. It then also leads to the Cambodian general election in 2023, which coming up next year, which would then demonstrate if the co-optation of the implementation of the opposition party are enough to secure CPP victory and achieve, as Professor Slater and Professor Wong argue in their recent book, Democratizations Through Strength. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, thanks so much for the presentation. Lovely images, a really important topic. So we have some guests in attendance on Zoom. I think we have at least a few minutes for some questions. If anybody would like to to ask a question from the from our virtual audience? You can just raise your hand virtually or put it in the, I don't know if Jonathan has seen if there's been a question asked in the Q&A function. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and ask one question. So I was reminded a little bit of the way you just seem to describe these welfare initiatives coming out of political competition and arising from opposition. And it reminded me a bit of what we saw in Thailand, where when the Thai Rak Thai government was in power and Thaksin Shinawatra was prime minister and pushing for certain welfare initiatives. And then after the coup, the military regime sort of kept the same initiatives going. They had a hard time sort of rolling them back. And so we often hear that, welfare policy is like a ratchet. If as it gets more generous, it's hard to reverse it.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering so clearly the conditions of multi-party competition in Cambodia that might have sparked these reforms is no longer there now that we've got a, basically single party regime. And so I wonder if you think is there political momentum behind this kind of increased generosity of welfare policy? Or do you think that without the initial cause there, without the, that ongoing multi-party competition, that you think it's going to become a lower priority or has already become a lower priority from what you've seen?
Thank you for very important questions. It's from what I've seen so far, as of now, because this is still considered quite recent since the 2013 elections, even though now there's no main opposition party participating in the election. But I don't think the CPP would ever would lower the priority for the welfare policy, because now they don't have political party competition. I think they would continue to strengthen it. I think they see this as a win-win already. And in many of his public speech, the Prime Minister Hun Sen have always boldly brag about this, the national social protection policy being one, and aging policy being an important products of the win-win policy to promote equitable development in Cambodia. And a lot of Cambodian people, especially those who benefited at least from the National Social Protection Policy ID4 program, they speak highly of the government. They said that, those that I spoke to, they said that never in their lifetime they ever received money from the government like this, even though it's a small amount, but they still feel grateful from the government. And so I think this momentum will continue, and I don't think it will fade anytime soon.
Okay, that's great. Well, and of course, we think of other single party regimes like Vietnam and China, where again, the lack of multi-party competition doesn't totally reduce, the felt need of the government to actually be, providing some basic, welfare. And of course, a history of socialist governance as well also, plays a role in that.
Yeah.
Any of the our other attendees like to get a question in before we conclude?
I'm happy to share my contact too, in case anyone have curiosity about this study in Cambodia, even though, like I mentioned, it's ongoing research.
Right. Well, there's a lot of rich detail, and I think we don't pay nearly enough attention to Cambodia, even within Southeast Asian studies. So I think that it's a great way to kick off the semester with attention to an under-examined topic in an under-examined case, and I'm sure something that you're really at the forefront of letting us know these these dynamics as they're unfolding. So so thanks so much for taking that time to come and do this. I guess it's late at night where you are. And then of course hopefully this will then be so this is recorded, so hopefully we'll be able to be shareable, and people can come and learn a lot about the situation after the fact. And so as I know at the beginning, so for those of you at CSES, so there's going to be a potluck a week from today. So hopefully people will be able to attend that. And Soksamphoas, thanks so much for kicking off the year with such a really, really rich, really interesting presentation for us.
Thank you so much, Professor Slater
Okay.
and Jonathan Waldes. And I also will be happy to share my contact to Jonathan to anyone who may be curious about this paper. I also have forthcoming paper about this topic as well.
Terrific. Okay, well, everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and be well.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.